Okay, so this is just like an ANOVA recap, and then we'll start with t-tests. Okay, so remember, so far we've really only discussed having these quantitative outcomes. So let's say we have a quantitative variable. So for example, age, BMI, a test score, temperature, and if we have a single group and we want to compare it to a population mean, and we know the population mean, then we would use a one sample t-test. More typically, we would have more than one group, right? So if we have two independent groups, so they're completely independent. So for example, men and women, and we're doing a between group comparison, then we would use an independent t-test. If we have two groups, but those two groups are related, so for example, we have a single group of individuals and we measure temperature at time point 1 and time point 2, then we're doing this within group comparison. And in that case, we would want a dependent paired t-test or a paired t-test. Okay, so sort of in summary, for these t-tests, for the two sample t-tests at least, we have a quantitative dependent variable or outcome, and we have a categorical independent variable that has two levels. So it's just men and women or time point 1 versus time point 2. Okay. One-way ANOVAs are just an extension of this. So we still have a quantitative dependent variable or outcome. So again, age, BMI, test score, or temperature, but now we want to compare them across groups that have more than two levels. So for example, if we want to compare any of those quantitative variables across more than two independent groups, so for example, race, ethnicity, and in this case, if we've categorized it as white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, or other, then we would do a one-way ANOVA. And that's that's a between group comparison. Okay. And I do want to note, actually, and I don't know if BMI is something that you guys will look at in any of your research, but it's interesting because we have these typical cutoff scores, right, for BMI. We can look it up on the CDC. We actually did it in exercise 1, but we found in sort of like larger sample research that, you know, BMI is actually it's not a consistent measure across race and ethnicity. So for example, the categories for, you know, underweight, normal, overweight, and obese BMI categories differ for example, for Asians versus white individuals. So it's just, it's interesting that it's a very commonly used measure of like health and, you know, characterizing weight, but it isn't consistent across races. So anyway, that's totally an aside. So, okay, so again, if we have a quantitative outcome variable and we're looking at it across more than two levels of independent groups, then we're using a one-way ANOVA. And that's just sort of an extension of the independent t-test. Okay, so now if we want to take our quantitative variable and compare more than two dependent groups, so again, we have a single sample, for example, and we want to measure an outcome before, during, and after an exercise program. So now we're doing this within group comparison, right? Then we would do a one-way repeated measures ANOVA, and that is just an extension of the paired t-test. Okay, so as a summary, we have a quantitative dependent variable, and then we have a categorical independent variable with 3 or more levels. Okay, so last week we then talked about factorial ANOVA, or, you know, the examples were two-way ANOVA, but you can also extend that. So if you can extend it to three-way ANOVA, four-way, five-way, and we just refer to all of that. So anything more than one-way ANOVA, we refer to as factorial ANOVA. Okay, so remember, we talked about one-way ANOVA being pretty limited, right? So far, we only have this one outcome variable, a quantitative outcome, and then we have a single categorical predictor. But if we're interested in more than one categorical predictor, so for example, if we're interested in looking at hours of weekly exercise, and as our outcome, and we're interested in the independent variables relationship status, and then we've categorized them into 3 levels here. So single, dating, committed relationship. And we're also interested in race, ethnicity, and we've categorized that as white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and other. So now we have these 2 independent categorical variables that we're interested in. If we were to just use a one-way ANOVA, we would look at relationship status and hours of weekly exercise and conduct a one-way ANOVA. And then we would have to do another one-way ANOVA to look at hours of weekly exercise by race, ethnicity. Okay, but by doing these separate one-way ANOVAs, we're not actually able to look at how relationship status and race, ethnicity are related to each other, and how potentially their combined effect on weekly hours of weekly exercise, what that looks like. So we're not able to do that when we're doing this basically a stratified look at weekly exercise by conducting these separate one-way ANOVAs. So that's where a two-way ANOVA comes in. And for some reason, I'm not able to scroll down. Let's see. Okay, there. All right. So the two-way analysis of variance, so in this case, because we have 2 independent categorical variables, enables us to look at both the independent relationship between each of those variables and our outcome. So in this case, relationship status, that's our factor 1, and our dependent variable, hours of working out, and as well as our second variable, so race, ethnicity, against our outcome, and as well as the combination of these 2. So the interaction of these two factors on the effect of hours of working out, so our outcome. And then again, the process is the same. If we have like 3, 4, 5, 6 additional independent variables, we can also do that as well. Okay, so the hypotheses for a two-way ANOVA, so we have 3 questions, right? What is the effect of factor A, so relationship status, on the outcome? And we refer to that as the main effect of A. And that is the effect of A on the outcome independent of factor B. So we're adjusting or controlling for the other factor. The second hypothesis is there any effect of factor B on the outcome? And that's again independent of factor A. So we're controlling for the effect of factor A, and we're just looking at the main effect of factor B. And then the third hypothesis is there an interaction between the 2 factors? So remember, an interaction between 2 variables means that the effect of one of those variables on the outcome is not constant. So it differs by levels of the other variable. And we saw that, I think I showed up graphs, I don't think I have them here, but in the recorded lecture, I had figures where you could see slopes of effect A and effect B, and when they're parallel, that means there's no interaction. But if you see them diverge or converge, or especially if they cross over, then we would say that there is a significant interaction. Okay, so how would we interpret these results? So I'm throwing this up there because this is really, really important. If there is an interaction, we cannot just interpret the main effects. We have to conduct the appropriate linear contrast to get the appropriate main effects. And we kind of went over that in the recorded lecture when I talked about type 1, type 2, and type 3 sum of squares. So typically we would look probably at type 2 and type 3 most often. Type 2 being we would use those results if our interaction term is not significant. If the interaction term is significant, then we would have to look at our type 3 results. And hopefully that kind of comes together when we actually do this in class. But yeah, I just want to kind of emphasize this again. So if your interaction is significant, you can't just look at your main effects that don't take into consideration that interaction term. Okay, so just like we had in one-way ANOVA, we had a one-way ANOVA and then a repeated measures, one-way repeated measures ANOVA. So we also have factorial, or in this example, we have a two-way repeated measures ANOVA. So that can be run when you've measured any two within subject factors. Okay, so repeated measures ANOVA, it's like a paired t-test. We're looking at within subjects factors. And then if you want to understand if there's an interaction between these factors. So an example would be if in a study you've measured a dependent variable over time, and then all subjects have gone through 2 or more trials or treatments. So everybody has gone through each of those. So for example, a control group and a treatment group, and if everybody has, experienced the control and then crossed over and experienced the treatment, and you're measuring something over time, all of those comparisons are within your group of subjects. And so we would do a two-way repeated measures ANOVA. And then just like with a two-way ANOVA, if you have a significant interaction, then you need to make adjustments. So in this case, we would need to run separate one-way ANOVAs. So for example, if you have time and you have treatment groups, then you would run these one-way ANOVAs for time over versus the outcome, and then your treatment group versus the outcome. Okay, so we have the one-way ANOVA, two-way or factorial ANOVA, and now we have analysis of covariance. So far we've talked about looking at a continuous outcome, and then we have independent variables that are categorical, right? So for example, if we are looking at relationship status and race ethnicity on hours of exercise, right? Those two independent variables are categorical. And then we can consider, our previous example for our two-way repeated measures ANOVA, if we're looking at time point 1, 2, and 3. So let's say before, during, and after, or at the end of a trial, and then we have 2 treatment groups. Those we can also consider a 3-level and then a 2-level categorical independent variables. Okay. So an analysis of covariance is if we have a categorical factor as well as a continuous factor. So if we have, so I kind of gave an example where if you only have categorical or non-continuous factors, right? You just have these categorical independent variables, then you're just running an ANOVA. If you have a model with no categorical factors or everything is quantitative, then you're running a regression, right? So that would be, so an example would be our correlation. And that's just an example of a simple regression where you have 2 quantitative variables. But if you have something where you have both a continuous and a categorical factor or independent variable, that's when we're running an analysis of covariance. So it's pretty similar to an ANOVA. You're still examining the effect of your factor on the dependent variable, as well as, and we refer to this continuous independent variable as a covariate. So we're still looking at the effect of the covariate on the dependent variable. And then we can also look at how these two interact, if they interact, to have an effect on the dependent variable. So it's similar to an analysis of variance. It's just that now we have a single categorical independent variable and then a continuous independent variable, which we refer to as a covariate. Okay, so the hypotheses are similar. So remember in ANOVA, we were saying, and for the two-way ANOVA, our hypothesis was we're looking at the main effect of A, we're looking at the main effect of B, and then we're looking at the interaction. So in this case, because the factor, so let me go back. Oh, for some reason, I'm not able to go. Okay, there. So in this case, this is our primary variable of interest. We're interested in whether this intervention, so high intensity interval training, running or control, has an effect on our dependent variable or body fat. And we want to control or adjust or I can't think of any other terms off the top of my head, but we want to take into account the effect of caloric intake. So, but this is still the primary variable of interest. So we want to know if body fat differs by these 3 interventions. And we just want to control for caloric intake. So if it's different across those groups, we're adjusting for that. So our hypothesis then is that there is no significant effect of factor A. So in that example, it would be one of those exercise interventions on Y, or body fat, controlling for the covariate. And in this case, our covariate is number of calories consumed per day. And then the alternative hypothesis would just be that there is a significant effect of factor A, so the exercise program, on Y, or body fat, controlling for the covariate. And then just like with the ANOVA, we can also test the hypothesis that the covariate is significantly associated with the outcome. So it would just be analogous to saying that factor, we're looking at the main effect of factor B. Okay, in this case, it's continuous and we're just referring to it as a covariate. And then we can also look at the interaction between those two. Okay, so then I tossed it in there in the live recording. I talked about mixed ANOVA, so I thought I would just kind of wrap all of our ANOVAs up today and just sort of expand a little bit on mixed ANOVA here. And then we can kind of like take a break and focus on the exercises for next week. And then we can resume with the lectures. And I think the next thing we start to talk about is categorical analysis. So let's talk about mixed ANOVA. All right, so repeated measures ANOVA contains only within subject variables, okay, meaning all individuals take part in all conditions. So the example, for example, we have a group of individuals and we're measuring temperature at different time points. Okay, so all of those measures are happening within the same individuals. So we have a within subjects variable. For one-way or independent ANOVA, we're only looking at between subject variables. So for example, if we're looking at temperature, but we want to compare men versus women, those are independent groups. So we're looking at one-way or independent ANOVA. So mixed ANOVA contains both within and between subjects variables. Okay, so the primary purpose is to understand if there's an interaction between your within subjects factor and your between subjects factor on a dependent variable or outcome. So this is different from a two-way repeated measures design, right? So the two-way repeated measures design has two within subjects factors. So for example, we're measuring individuals over time. So, excuse me, before, during, or at the end of an exercise program, and then they're all taking part in an intervention and the control group, for example. So everybody is undergoing all conditions, and so we have only within subjects factors. The mixed ANOVA has one within and one between factor. So for example, maybe we measure all subjects over time, but only some subjects receive the control and only some subjects receive the treatment. Okay, so here's an example. Let's say we're interested in discovering whether the intensity of an exercise training program with equal calorific expenditure has an effect on cholesterol concentration over a 6-month period. So our specific study design would be, we have 60 participants, we recruited them and assigned them to 3 groups. So the first group is the control group. And then we're looking at, the second group would be low intensity exercise. So those individuals would exercise long enough at a low intensity so that they're expending 1,000 calories per week. And then we have a third group, the high intensity training group, and those individuals would exercise long enough so that they are expending 1,000 calories per week. So just like the low intensity exercise, but probably for less time, right? So the high intensity group exercises less time, but they expend the same amount of calories. And then we have a 6-month study, and we measured cholesterol at baseline, 3 months, and 6 months. Okay, so that would be an example where we would use a mixed ANOVA because we have this within group factor, right? Our time, so baseline, 3 months, and 6 months. And then we have a between group comparison or factor, control, low intensity, and high intensity exercise, since individuals could only be in one of those 3 groups. Okay, So this is just kind of breaking it down. So the dependent variable, again, our outcome is cholesterol concentration. Our within subjects factor is time. And then our between subjects factor is exercise conditions. Okay, so that's all I had for that. Are there any questions? And then as I do that, as I'm waiting to see if you have any questions, I'm going to open up the final exercise and go over that.
I have a bunch of questions, but I just don't know them right now.
Oh, okay, that's totally fine. You can always email me or you know, put it in the chat later. Totally up to you. Okay.
That's crazy because I'm starting to, well, no, I mean, I didn't know myself, but I always thought it was kind of interesting. My buddy was denied into the military because of BMI, but he's Samoan, so I mean, those guys are huge, and so they said that he was too overweight, and I was just so
Okay.
confused because he at all overweight.
That's really interesting. Did they measure, so after they determined that his BMI was too high, did they measure his neck or his wrists by any chance? Do you know?
Oh no, not at all. No.
Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so just, I mean, maybe this is not interesting, but my husband was in the military and he had the same issue. So he always came out like overweight, and then they would have to measure his neck and then determine like, okay, it's just his musculature. So you're right. You're actually bringing up a really good point. So for people who are very muscular, BMI is not a good measure. And then kind of as I mentioned, BMI is also like the cutoffs that we use based on the CDC cutoffs. You know, if you just Google it, like CDC BMI categories, they actually are not the best cutoff values for, you know, for some racial and ethnic minority groups. So for example, for Asians and Pacific Islanders, it's not really the best. They're not the best cutoffs. They typically are like shifted down. So yeah, so it's interesting, like BMI is very commonly used, but it's not always the best measure. So I would say
they also this huh?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say they have the CDC has like another chart that takes race and ethnicity into account.
Oh, awesome.
And it's like I want to see what they do because it's like not too much different.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of like shifted one way or the other. So I think body fat percentage, but even then, because our body fat can be distributed differently, right? And if we have a lot of like central body fat, like so central adiposity, that's actually worse, right? If we carry all of our weight, you know, in our center, that's kind of an indicator that we have high levels of cortisol or stress hormones. So it's just interesting, like the distribution of our body fat matters too. And you guys probably know about that way more than I do. But okay, let me, if it's okay.
That's what the range.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna start covering the final project, and then I'm gonna throw up an example of a poster presentation for everybody. That's all of this is posted on Cougar Courses, but I kind of wanted to go over it before we start the exercise. And I think after doing the exercise over the weekend, we'll probably only get through one question, and you'll see why. And then I have like a great meme to share with you that one of my friends actually sent to me today, and I was like, this is very, very appropriate for this class right now. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right. Okay. So if you haven't looked at this, that's totally fine because this is sort of the end, you know, this is due at the very end of the semester, I think May 20th. So whatever the last day of your exams are, that's when this is due. and your research question isn't due for another month and a half or so, but hopefully you've started thinking about it. So I have this up on Cougar Courses. It's just a description. Basically, what you're going to do is write like a mini paper. You're going to conduct a study. And a lot of what we've been doing in the exercise so far is very similar to this, right? So let's say you have a research question, based on some of the things that we've been doing. For example, let's say for the sprint times, question on exercise 1, maybe the research question is, does this supplement improve sprint times? And does it improve sprint times for men and women differently, for example? So that might be a research question. And then you'll have hypotheses. So you'll have research hypotheses. So your research hypothesis in that example would be, we hypothesize that the supplement does improve sprint times. Okay, and then that's different from your statistical hypotheses, right? So, so our statistical hypotheses, typically we have a null hypothesis, and our null hypothesis is always, this group is equal to this group. So in that example of a supplement and improving sprint times, our statistical hypothesis is that the supplement does not improve sprint time. So the sprint times before taking the supplement and sprint time after the supplement are the same. And then the alternative hypothesis is typically what matches up with our research hypothesis. So the alternative hypothesis in that example would be the sprint times before taking the supplement are different from the sprint times after the supplement, taking the supplement, and that matches up with the research hypothesis, right? So basically, you're going to come up with a research question. You've seen, so far we use these small, data sets, physiology and sprint times data sets. There are other publicly available data sets through R, but also, so we're using NHANES data. And if you look at the CDC website, they have NHANES data, but they also have the behavioral risk factors survey data. They have that for adolescents as well. So that's the youth behavioral risk factor survey. So there's lots of national survey data that are also publicly available that you can also draw from. If you don't have data already for your thesis, for example, then you can draw from one of these publicly available data sets as well. And then again, if you are working on your thesis, even if you don't have a complete data set, so you haven't collected all of the subjects that you need for your thesis, you can always, conduct your study on the subjects that you currently have. So that's perfectly fine as well. Okay, so you're going to use R to conduct your statistical analyses, and then conduct the appropriate statistical tests. I'll want to see if that you're testing the assumptions of whatever statistical test you end up using. And then once you conduct your analysis, you're going to have a written assignment. So you'll have at least 2 tables. And so far we've created, this quote table 1, and that's our descriptive table. And so you've already actually created a standard table that almost everybody who writes up a manuscript for scientific publications have a table 1. So you've already done that. So you would include at least 2 tables and a figure and into your write-up. And then the other kind of big note is you want to include at least 8 peer-reviewed sources. So you might find that on PubMed, Web Science. If you haven't done this for other classes, feel free to reach out to me and I can share resources with you. But these are basically other peer-reviewed publications that you're going to be citing in your own research. So let's say you're conducting a study and there's already an existing body of literature that maybe suggests what you might be finding, or they're somehow related to the research project that you're conducting, you'll want to cite that information. So that's kind of referring to sort of the reason for why you're conducting your research study. Maybe there are gaps in the literature. And then once you have your results, you might also cite other studies in your discussion section. So maybe you're going to tie in your results with the results that are in the existing literature and put that all together. And so that's another instance where you would be citing other peer-reviewed literature as well. Okay. And then if you just go through this, it has specific guidelines for how your written assignment should look. And then we can kind of, if you want, cover this more, but also feel free to email me if you have questions about this. And kind of like I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, towards the end, once we're almost at the finish line with these lectures, and we're going to be able to start focusing just on the exercises. And once we finish the exercises, then we can start to really just focus on working on your project in class. And so I need to think about how I'm going to do that, but basically everybody at home, you can start working on the analyses for your project. And then if you have questions, then you can share your screen with me. I'll figure out how we can do that, where maybe you just share it with me if you don't want the entire class to see, and we can kind of figure out if there are any issues, that we can resolve together during class. So if you look at the syllabus, there are, I think, 3 or 4 class sessions that are dedicated to working on your final project. So that you're not working on all of it outside of class. And I'm also able to help you during class if you're running into issues with analyses or setting up your data, for example. Okay, so that's that. Oh, I'm sorry, the one last note is references. We'll be using the APA formatting. And then there's just a link for more information on how to do that. So I'm going to stop share. And then the last thing I'll do is share a poster with you. So remember, we have the final project, and that's a write-up. So it's a written assignment. And then at the end of the semester, so I think the last class that we have might be the 4th or the 13th. So whatever the last actual class we have, we will all take turns presenting our research in a poster format. So let me, sorry, I didn't share this. So let me share this so you can see. Okay, here. Let me see if I can increase it, probably not. Okay, so this is just an example of a poster. If you go to like a research symposium or any national or international conference where you're presenting your findings, typically, unless you're doing like an oral presentation, you would have a poster. So it's, you'd have a really big poster, you'd have it up on on a board, and people are able to walk by and look at your poster and ask you questions. And typically, at these poster sessions, and even in these virtual, conference, a lot of conferences now are virtual. It's the same thing where you have this poster, and then you might speak for 2 or 3 minutes, sort of summarizing your study. And then people, who are either walking by, so if this is like an in-person conference, or in these virtual conferences, they would like attend your virtual poster presentation. They can then ask you questions about your study. So, you would give this like 2 to 3 like elevator speech about your study, and then you would have time for questions. So that's basically the format that we'll use for class as well. So you'll put together a poster, and then, I'll have you share it with the class, and then you can just speak for 2 to 3 minutes about your research, why you conducted your research, what analyses you used, and then, more, I think most importantly for a lot of these poster presentations, what were your findings? And then students or I, we can ask you questions about your study. So this is up on Cougar Courses. This is just an example and it's very much set up similarly to an abstract. So it's just like a brief summary of your research, which is something that you'll write up for your final project as well for the written assignment. So you just have the introduction section. It gives like a background information on your study. And then you have methods, so the types of analyses that you used for your study, and then your results. And then you can see like in here, I have some figures, you know, and then I've plotted, they're referred to as odds ratios here. So I have additional figures. And then you have a little section sort of like concluding. So you're just summarizing your results and trying to tie it in with previous findings or information in existing literature. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that and then just, let's see what time is it. Okay, so pause and see if anyone has any questions. And then as I'm waiting to see if you have any questions, I'm going to open up R. And then hopefully you've all had a chance to save the NHANES, the merge data set that we created, and then into an R data set. And then that way we can just import it into R right away. So as I'm closing all this out, go ahead and start opening up R. I'm going to do the same thing. Okay. Okay, let me know when you've opened up R, and then if you were able to import your NHANES data set. I'm actually scrolling through my program to make sure that I can do this now as well. Okay. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, awesome. So yeah, if you have it open already, so you just sort of saved it from last week, there's code that I'll send through the chat so that you can save it. Just so that if anything happens, you already have this merged data set, you don't have to go back and import all your data all over again and do all of the recoding that we did last week. So anytime I do these, like, let's say we, like last week, for example, we spent quite a bit of time recoding some variables and, merging our data sets and all of that. Once I do something like that, I save, even if it's sort of like an interim data set, I still I save it just so that I don't have to do all of those tasks all over again. So let me scroll to where you can do that. So if you use this code, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you see this code, I'm going to share that so that you guys can, and again, I have a datasets folder in my working directory, so it's going to save that here, and it's going to save that into that folder specifically. So this is my working directory. So you might want to go ahead and set your working directory. So remember, go to home and the files tab, and then once you're where you want to be working from, you can set as your working directory. Okay, so I'm going to copy and send this to everybody so you can, modify it as you need to and save your data set. Can I ask like a just sort of a random question? How do you guys feel about R so far? Like super, super honest, and how it, like, because I know a lot of you are using MATLAB as well. How do you feel about R compared to like MATLAB or any other programming language that you've used? I'm just curious.
I really like it. I think I like it the the best out of
Okay.
all the stuff that I've used.
Okay. Awesome.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh yeah, sure.
Because I don't have mine saved, and I tried to import it again, like the
Okay.
same way we did last time. It's saying that they couldn't find the function like sas export.get,
Okay.
like the way
Okay.
we'd done.
Okay, so I'm guessing you maybe the merge data set just never saved. Let me see if I can send my nhanes.r data through the chat. And then, if you save it, to your whatever your working directory is, you should be able to then load it from there. And it's totally like, so I see your comment too, like, yeah. I think this is totally normal to not feel comfortable with like any programming language. And R is probably, it's a little less friendly than, some of the other languages like SPSS and Stata, and maybe even SAS, because it's you're having to code so much more, whereas some of these other programming languages you can do more like click. It's more interactive. So and I don't know, maybe not as pretty either. But I am glad that's interesting that you guys like it more than MATLAB, because I feel like they're pretty similar in a lot of ways, but maybe more versatile. I think R could be more versatile. So, all right, let me see if I can send this.
I might have gotten it to work. I just like ran everything we did last week, and now I have stuff in my environment. So I think I got it.
Okay, so you're good. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, sure. Let me send this data set over if I can, just in case for anyone else who maybe has not been able to load it. Okay, awesome. It actually went through. It's not actually a big file. We have a lot of observations, right? We had almost 10,000 people. Actually, once we restricted it, then, it went down, I think, to about half its size, but it's all text data. So it's not like a huge file. Okay, so there's the nhanes file. That's what we're going to start working with. Does everyone have it open now? I don't want to move on until like you actually have the data. So if you don't, let me know. And okay, so I'm just going to assume that everyone has their nhanes data set now. Okay, so I'm going to load my data set. And remember we have about, okay, so yeah, so we started with about 10,000 people, and then we restricted it to individuals over the age of 20, and our sample size went down. We had 193 variables when we merged everything together, and then we created these new variables that we had recoded, right? So that's just kind of like a recap of what we did up here. And then another really big thing that I want to note, because it will be relevant when we do this next question, is we had already, so we were kind of like ahead of the curve. We had already recoded these 7777 and 9999. So remember, that's refused and then just did not know. We recoded those to missing. Okay, so we wouldn't want to keep them in as those values, especially if we look at what these variables represent, right? This is minutes of exercise per day. And, if we were to keep these values, those would be very, very, very extreme outliers. And we probably end up, finding them anyway when we look for outliers and removing them from our data. But it's good to know that, I think it's just kind of a reminder to go back to the code book, look at what the values are for each of the categories, or for this quantitative variable, if there are any, special values that they've assigned, such as these, and then determine the appropriate thing to do with them. And in this case, we're actually going to end up excluding them from our analysis, right? So they're missing, so we can't analyze that data. Okay, so I have a note here that we're resuming. Okay, let's see. Oh, all right. So Question 3 is there a difference in reporting of minutes of moderate intensity exercise or vigorous intensity exercise by gender? So it's actually asking two things here. The first is we're going to look at moderate intensity exercise. And remember, that's minutes of exercise per day. And we're looking to see if there's differences by gender. And remember, gender, in this case, we have male and female, so it's 2 levels. So what test would we use? Just sort of just off the bat, what test would we use? So we have a continuous outcome and we have a categorical or independent variable with 2 levels. So they're independent. So we would be using an independent 2-sample t-test. Okay, what we're actually going to find, and I don't know if it was intentional. I honestly don't know if, so Dr. Armenta set this up. It's a really nice exercise. I don't know if it was intentional to still run the t-test, but what we're actually going to find is that a t-test is probably not appropriate in this case. And so if you recall, and probably not, because even I had to go back to the lecture and make sure we actually covered this, if we don't meet some of the assumptions of the t-test, so normality of our outcome variable, for example, then we would have to use one of these other rank tests, so Wilcoxon ranked sum test. So if you remember, I mentioned, for these non-parametric tests that don't rely on a specific distribution for our data, that's why they're referred to as non-parametric. We convert all of our scores, so the values of our data, into ranks, and we just rank them. And then we actually use the rank numbers of those scores to run our comparison. So let's just kind of explore what the data looks like, and then we'll decide whether we should run a t-test or one of these non-parametric tests. And I apologize because even though I brought it up in the t-test lecture and brought up these non-parametric tests as alternatives, we're actually going to cover it in more detail later. So I believe either the next lecture or the one after that, we'll cover it in a little bit more detail. So we're kind of a little bit ahead of ourselves here. But let's explore the data, and this is a process that you would need to do for any analyses, so for your thesis or for the final project as well. Okay, so again, our options, because we have a continuous outcome, so in this case, minutes exercise, and we're just going to do them separately. We're going to look at moderate exercise first, and a 2-level predictor, so gender. We would use an independent t-test, or we will use a Wilcoxon rank sum test, and that's just the non-parametric alternative to the t-test for independent groups. So it's going to be one of these 2 tests. Okay, but let's look at our data first, and then we'll decide which one would be more appropriate. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is, we know that in our moderate activity variable, there are missings. Right, so I can even look at that. So let's say if I were to look at, summary in Haynes, and remember, moderate activity was the variable that we created. So it was initially this like PE something 675, and then we recoded those 7777s and 9999s to missing. And when we did that, we created a new variable. And so remember, the idea is if we're recoding variables, it's always good practice to create a new one instead of just recoding our original and keeping that same name, because at that point, we're not able to go back and make any additional changes to the original variable. So it's always good practice to do that with variables. It's always a good practice to do that with data sets as well. So let me show you what that looks like. Okay, so first, let's look at moderate activity. And then if you look in the console down here, we can see that the mean is 63 minutes, the median is 45. So already those 2 values are pretty far apart from each other. So we can kind of guess that it's probably pretty skewed data, or we have these outliers that are pulling our data in one direction or the other. And you can actually see there, the maximum value is 600 minutes, which seems pretty implausible, right? I can see somebody doing recreational exercise, maybe if they're like running an ultra marathon, for example, then absolutely they would be running, potentially for 10 hours that one day. But, the question was, on average, how many minutes, do you engage in moderate recreational activity every day? So 10 hours every day on average seems, probably unlikely. I'm sure there are like people out there, but it's very unlikely. So, so already we can see, this is probably an outlier. The other thing that we can see from this output in the summary is that there are 3,349 individuals with missing values. Those missing values, it didn't cause an issue for the summary function, but it will actually cause issues for other functions. So let me just give you an example. If I want to run the mean of that variable of moderate activity, it won't let me. So the response that I get is NA. So that's basically R telling me I can't calculate a mean on missing values. So some programs will actually, what they'll do is they'll look at those missing values and just calculate the mean on the non-missing values. R is actually, it's probably more appropriate the way R handles it, which is to tell you, hey, you have these missing values in your variable. You might want to do something with them before you run your analysis. So, so it's actually a good thing, I think, that, if we were to try to get a mean for this variable using the mean function, R is telling us, I can't do that. I'm going to spit back an NA to you. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove all of the rows. So all of the individuals that have a missing value for moderate activity, we're going to remove them. Okay, and so just like when we recode a variable and we create a new variable with a new name, we're going to do the same thing with our data sets. The reason being is, once I remove these missing values from the data set, they're not there anymore. I'm removing people that might have non-missing values for other variables. So maybe they're missing moderate activity, but they're not missing, for example, vigorous activity. And maybe I want to keep them for the vigorous activity analysis. So I want to kind of it's good practice to keep these separate so I can always go back to my original data set and modify that if I need to in whatever way that I need to. So in this particular case, we're just removing individuals who are missing moderate activity. And let me just explain what this part means. So is NA is a function and it'll identify if something is missing. So remember, NA means missing in R. So is.NA is just a function that will identify missings. So if I, for example, had a variable here and it was missing and I just use this function, let's say it was missing, then R would spit back true. So here what I'm saying is, if it's not missing, so that's what that exclamation mark means. In R, in our programming language, the exclamation mark means no. So what I'm saying here is, if it's not missing, if this variable or value is not missing, then please keep it and put it into this data set in Haynes _, and I'm calling it mod1 for moderate activity. And I'm going to create multiple data sets with this mod variable, and so I'm calling it 1. And then that way I can create another one, mod 2, mod 3, mod 4. Okay, so I'm going to copy and paste this code into the chat so that you guys can run it as well. Okay, and then I need to run it. Create. And then once you run it, if you look into the upper right window, you can see we have the new data set, NHANES mod 1, and that looks about right? The number of observations, because remember we had over 3,000 missings. So once we remove those, it makes sense. We're left with about 2,000 individuals. Okay. Now that we've removed those missings, we can use the mean and the standard deviation, or SD functions, to look at the mean and standard deviation of our variable. And I'm going to copy that into the chat as well. Okay. So once you run that, you can see that the mean now it's 63. So it's the same as it was up here, right? Because the summary function was able to calculate the mean and the median and just ignore the missings. So this value is the same as it is up here. And then our standard deviation is 56, which is pretty big, right? So that tells us that the spread of our distribution it's pretty spread out, but it might be because of these outliers. So remember, for the t-test, we would check for normality, and we would also check to see if we have outliers in our data. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I think we already installed the CAR package, but if not, let's install it and load it so that we can run this box plot. So if you remember, there's a box plot function with lowercase b, but that doesn't identify outliers. It'll give you a nice box plot, and it'll have like dots, remember, on either side of the whiskers or outliers, but it won't tell you which individuals are actually outliers. This box plot with a capital B, it does, but you need this you need to install this CAR package to do that first. So let's run that. So there's the code for that. I'm going to run it on my end as well. Okay, so let's just give it a bit of time. It's going to install it and then load that package. Okay, so the first thing I want to direct you to is the box plot on the right-hand side. Okay, so it looks like the distribution it's pretty tight right here, right? With the 75th percentile being, or I'm sorry, the maximum value, ignoring all of these outliers up here, being about 100 minutes. Which I think to me seems pretty plausible, right? So like, what would that be? A little less than 2 hours a day of moderate activity. And that to me seems pretty reasonable. But if you look at these guys out here, these are outliers. And remember, we can define an outlier, and this is what this function is also doing, as individuals who fall more than 1.5 standard deviations outside of the, 1.5 of times the interquartile range below the 25th percentile or above the 75th percentile. So this is our 25th percentile, this bottom part of the box. This is our 75th percentile. And then between that is what we refer to as our interquartile range. So if that range times 1.5, and we have individuals more than that, above the third quartile or below the first quartile, then we would designate those as outliers. So this box plot function is basically, it has all these dots to indicate outliers, and then these numbers indicate the row corresponding to the individual that it has that outlying value. So you can also see that here. So I'm going to direct you back to the console area down here, so the bottom left corner, and it just shows you the same information that it does here. And it just shows you the first 10 outliers. So this person here is the most extreme outlier, and then it just kind of goes down from here. So if we wanted to look to see what is the value of moderate activity for this individual that ours is highlighting as an outlier, we can actually do that. So what we would do for just that one element or one observation is to look at this individual And we would just use the code here. So let me copy and paste that into the chat. Okay. All right. So if you were to run that, R will spit out the value of moderate activity for observation 2107. And you can see here that it's 600, which makes sense, right? So if I were to scroll back up here, remember our maximum value was 600 minutes. So R is correctly pointing out this is the most extreme, and this person happens to be an outlier as well. And this person has the maximum value. And then again, it's probably pretty implausible, right? So it might be someone that we want to remove from our analysis before we actually run our tests, or before we actually run our analysis. So if you want to look at a single individual, you would use this line of code. But remember, R gave us the top 10 individuals out extreme values. So if you want to look at all of them, we can use this code. And remember, this C just stands for combine. So we're basically just asking R, I want to know the moderate activity values for individuals with in these rows. So 2107, 384, and so on. Okay. So I'm going to also send you this code so you can run that too. Okay. So when I run that, it now shows me the values for moderate activity for those top 10 individuals. And you can see it ranges from 600 minutes, and then we have individuals, you know, at 300 minutes as well, which corresponds to 5 hours, which still seems maybe implausible, right? Because this is sort of average daily minutes of exercise. Again, I can see it happening, like maybe somebody runs a marathon. And so Saturday, you know, 300 minutes absolutely makes sense, but to do it daily is probably unlikely. Okay, so I'm guessing these people are probably outliers. But remember, removing outliers is an iterative process, right? So good practice would be to remove the most extreme value and then look at how our data is distributed again. So let's just do that for kind of practice sake and see what that looks like. So remember, our most extreme value was observation 2107, and that person, that person had 600 minutes for their moderate activity value. So let's remove them. And then again, remember, once I start manipulating my data, it's always good practice to create new data sets instead of changing it within our data and not being able to go back. So as I remove this individual, I'm going to create a new data set. Okay, so you'll see here, there's a negative C, and that just means I want to remove individual. So that negative sign means I'm going to remove that individual 2107, and that's going to create a new data set, NHANES mod 2. So I'm going to copy and paste that into the chat so you can run that as well. Okay. All right. And then I'll go ahead and run it as well. And then once you run that, if you look to the right-hand side here, you can see I've created this new data set _mod 2, and it has one less observation, right? So I can just kind of assume, all right, my code ran properly. I meant to just remove that one individual. Okay. And all right. So now we've removed that most extreme outlier. Now let's run a box plot and see what it looks like. So even after removing that extreme outlier, I still have a bunch of outliers up here. And if you look down here in the console area, R is telling me, okay, these are now the top 10 extreme values. So if you remember, when we had our list of extreme values before we removed the individual with 600 minutes of moderate activity, our lowest value in that string of 10 was 300 minutes, right? So it was this person here. So now we have a new set of 10 individuals. Okay, and if you look, it's the same individuals as up here, but with 2107 removed, right? So they've all just sort of shifted to the left, and now we have an additional 10th person here. So what I want to do is see, okay, this is of the top 10 extreme values that R is pointing out to me. This person at the end has, quote, the least extreme, or it's going to be the lowest value of those 10. So I want to know what is that value? How many minutes of moderate activity does this 10th person have? Okay, so I'm going to look at, again, I'm pulling out the value for moderate activity for individual 605. Okay, so let me copy and paste that. Okay, so you should be able to run that. Let me run it as well. And then that person also has 300 minutes. So now that we've done this, like, what do you guys think? We probably have quite a number of people actually with 300 minutes. It's probably pretty unlikely, right? So if we were to keep doing this by hand, it would be pretty just kind of daunting, especially because we have about 2,000 people. So there is actually code available that will kind of automate this process for us. Okay, so first thing, okay, sorry, let me backtrack. All right, let's subset first to everybody with a value of less than 300 minutes. So I'm making a determination based on the data. I do already know that someone with a value of 300 minutes or more are considered outliers given the distribution of my data. And I also know that 5 hours daily seems pretty unlikely, especially when our mean is an hour a day. So, if someone reports 5 hours weekly, maybe they misheard the question. I believe they're actually interviewed like over the phone. Maybe they reported 5 hours because they were thinking, well, that's about how many hours I exercise weekly. So most likely this is, like incorrect data, right? So the first thing I'm going to do then is just remove everybody who has a value of 300 or more. Or in this case, the code is actually saying I'm subsetting to all individuals with less than 300 minutes of exercise per day. And then I'll look at the distribution. So instead of just doing this iteratively, like I'm going to remove the person with 600 minutes, then I'm going to remove the person with 420 minutes. I'm just going to make this, kind of decision to say, I think everybody with 300 minutes or more, I can call those outliers. I'm going to just remove all of them. And then let's see what our distribution looks like. Okay, so let me copy and paste that for you guys. Okay, and then I'm going to run it as well. So again, I've created this new data set and I'm subsetting to those individuals with moderate activity less than 300 minutes. Okay, and it looks like it removed about 24 people. So if you look up here in the upper right-hand corner, this is my new data set. And all of these individuals have less than 300 minutes of moderate activity per day. Okay. Actually, let me delete that comment there. Okay. So now, again, let's look at the box plot so our distribution of the data, now that we removed those individuals with 300 or more minutes of exercise per day. And I'm just gonna copy this into the chat as well, so you guys can run that. Okay. So I ran my box plot on this new data set, and you can see it still has outliers, right? this value, so I'm taking the individual, so of these top 10 extreme values that R is pulling out and identifying as outliers, I'm going to look at sort of the least extreme of these 10 values. So that's person 276, and look at the value, and it's 240 minutes, okay, which is 4 hours, which maybe still seems probably pretty, implausible, right? So as I was saying, I kind of got ahead of myself, so I apologize. If we iteratively do this, if we keep doing this by hand, it's probably going to take forever. And you guys will probably start to really hate R and hate like analyses in general. So the good news is that someone has developed code that will automate this process for us. So it will remove outliers that fall outside of this 1.5 times our interquartile range. So if it's above the 75th percentile by that much or below by that much, then they're considered outliers, and this program will remove it for us, okay? So let me just actually show you. So I'm gonna copy and paste this. Hold on. This is why I kind of knew that we might not get through, we might only get through one question, because I kind of wanted to show you this process in case you need to do it for your project as well. And now I can't seem to get back to, let's see. Okay. So I'm going to show you what this website looks like. All right. New share. Okay, so this is actually the program. This is like documentation for that program. So somebody developed a script basically. So this is our code. She developed this to remove those outliers. Okay, so it's really nice. Like we don't have to do this by hand. Someone has like, written this nice, like complicated program to do that for us. And all we need to do is run this line, these 2 lines of code. So this first code is basically telling us this is where the source of our code that we're going to run. So by running this first, it's referring actually to this website and to this source code. Okay, and once we have that, then we can run the function that she's written up here. So the function she wrote is outlier KD, and then we're going to specify our data set here and then the variable here. Okay, once that happens, there's going to be output in our console area, and then she's going to give us the option of removing the outliers and replacing them with missing. And we can say no, or we can say yes after looking at this information here. Okay, and then the other thing her code does is provides a box plot and a histogram for the data before we've removed the outliers and after we remove the outliers. So this is like a really nice thing that this person has written for us and created this function for us. So we're just gonna run that in R. So I'm gonna go back to R now. Okay. All right. So all right, so this is that code that I was talking about. So remember, the source is just pointing to her website and that code that she wrote, the function that she wrote, and then we're going to run her function, okay? The first thing we're gonna do though is look at sort of just, let's get a summary. So what we did above when we created these box plots, we looked at the top 10 extreme values or outliers in our data. Now let's use this box plot stats function just to look at all of the outliers. So let me highlight that, and then I'm also going to copy it and share it with you guys so you can run it too. Okay. Oh, here. Okay. There we go. Okay, so go ahead and run that, and then you'll see in the output all of the individuals who meet this requirement here, that they're above and below 1.5 times the interquartile range, okay? it is kind of interesting to me actually that, 120 minutes, so that corresponds to 2 hours. Those are all still considered outliers, because I feel like that value is pretty plausible, right? Like moderate recreational activity, like 2 hours a day doesn't seem all that unlikely to me. But if you remember, this is, this is drawn, so this is NHANES data. So it's drawn, it's meant to be representative of the general population. And probably in the general population, maybe 2 hours is a bit extreme. And if you recall, the mean of our minutes of exercise per day, even with the outliers in it, so right, kind of drawing it to the right, so to a larger mean. So even with those outliers, the average was about 60 minutes. So then when we think about that, then it kind of does make sense. Like, all right, 2 hours maybe seems, pretty likely to individuals who are very physically active, but maybe for the general population, 2 hours a day is pretty unlikely, and they are actually outliers. So we're going to run that program that I showed you, that this person has already written for us, and it's going to, we will decide whether we want to remove all of these individuals that are outliers, by the statistical definition. So again, before we do that, just in case we do remove our outliers, we want to create a new data set, because we don't want to, take out all of these outliers and we can't go back. So again, good practice to create a new data set. And I'm just going to use this original mod 1, right? Because all of these mod 2, mod 3, we had removed individual outliers. So I want to go back to my original mod 1 data set, which removed the all the missing values from the start. So anyone who just didn't have a value for moderate activity, once we remove them, we called that mod 1. So I'm just going to create a mod 4 data set that is exactly the same as the mod 1 data set, but then I can manipulate this one and still have the original mod 1 data set that's like untouched. So if I need to go back and modify things, change things, I can do that. So first thing is we'll create this new data set, mod 4, that we can modify. So let me put that in the chat as well. Oh, yeah, sure. So here's the link. Okay. All right. So there's the link to that, basically the function that that's going to remove the outliers for us. Okay. So, okay, I haven't run this yet. So, all right. So here we have mod 4. And then if you see, like, it's probably, right, the observations are the same as mod 1, because basically what we've done is we've just duplicated this data set. Okay, now let's run our data. So again, this is pointing to the source code for that function that was written. Okay, and then this is the actual function that she wrote, and this is the data set name and the variable name. And let me just copy that over for you guys, okay? Oops. Okay, so I'll let you run that. Okay. Once you've run that code, if you look here on the bottom right corner, remember, this is the distribution. She wrote her code so that it presents the box plot and a histogram for our moderate activity variable before removing the outliers and after removing our outliers. Okay. So if you look at this new box plot, it's great. We don't have outliers, but this dark line here is the median, or I'm sorry, is the is the median, and the mean, and it looks like it's pretty skewed, right? Because it's very close actually to the first quartile. It might also just be squished. So if we look at the histogram too, it doesn't really look like a normal distribution. You know, it looks pretty actually like almost trimodal, right? We have these like 3 peaks. So already, you know, we can kind of think maybe a t-test is not the best statistical test for this data. If in your exercise, if you were to run a t-test after doing all of this, that would be fine. I honestly would not, you know, it would, especially with such a large sample size, I honestly don't, you know, I would not say, okay, that's inappropriate, because you've kind of run through the process and then now you're sort of making a determination. You know, should I run a t-test, you know, or should I run a non-parametric test? What I've done here is I've kind of gone on and looked at, tested the data for normality, and then based on that, decided what I should do. Okay, so the second thing that I want to point you to after we've run this outlier KD function is, remember, that function gives us information down here in our console. So it tells us the number of outliers that were identified, the percentage of our sample that were considered outliers. So 402 out of the 2,000 or so observations were considered outliers, and that represents about 17% of our sample. The mean value of our outliers is 164 minutes. So that's almost 3 hours per day. The mean, if we don't remove the outliers, is an hour per day of moderate activity. If we were to remove the outliers, then the mean goes down to about 40 minutes a day. Okay, so in this case, we've looked at all of the outliers. We've kind of talked through that 120 minutes for maybe very physically active individuals doesn't seem implausible, but probably for the general population, they probably are truly outliers. And either, you know, maybe they're actually reporting it accurately and saying, you know, yes, I do exercise on average 2 hours per day. But given the distribution of everybody else in our sample, they're still considered statistical outliers. So the determination that we're going to make here is, why don't we go ahead and remove them? Okay, so this is kind of nice down here in the console. That function will then ask us this question: do we want to remove the outliers and set those outliers to NA, or missing? Okay, and so what I'm going to say is yes. So go ahead and put yes in your console, and then you should get this result saying outliers were successfully removed. So now they've been removed from this NHANES Mod 4 data set. So we have the same number of observations, right? Because we didn't remove those outliers, we've just set them to missing. But remember, for a lot of functions in R, if we have missing values on a variable that we're trying to run statistics on, that can cause issues. So we need to remove those individuals from our final analytic data set. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. So we're creating this new data set. Now it's mod 5. And we're saying if the values are not missing for moderate activity, then keep them in this new data set mod 5. So I'm going to copy and paste that. There we go. Okay, so if you run that, now we have about 1,800 observations in our new mod 5 data set. And you can see that in the upper right-hand corner, which makes sense, right? Because we had about 400 outliers from our sample of 2,200. The functions outlier KD set them to missing, and then we remove them from our data set, mod 5. So we're left with 1,800 individuals. So those numbers sound about right to us, right? Okay. Now that they've all been removed, so let me change that. Now let's check our assumptions. All right, so now we're gonna run a histogram. Sorry, we need to load. I'm gonna just copy and paste all of this code and send that over to you guys. So this is just loading the ggpubr package, which then enables us to actually run this density function. So we're gonna run the histogram. And remember, it looks just like the histogram that was output by that outlier KD function, right? Where it doesn't quite look normal. There's like something funky going on over here. And if we were to run the density plot, you can see that, right? It's not really a normal distribution. And it looks, you know, it looks pretty, it actually looks like trimodal, right? It has like these 3 peaks here. What's another thing we can do to test for normality? We can look at a QQ plot. So that's what I'm doing here. You guys should have all this code, so it probably is showing all these plots. It looks maybe kind of normal, but you have these people off the line here. This is our, you know, normal line, and you have people who are who really deviate from that in these areas, especially at the ends. So this is just kind of more evidence, like maybe our data is not normally distributed. Maybe a t-test is not appropriate in this situation, you know, even though we have this large sample size. So the final thing I'm going to do is run the Shapiro-Wilk test, right? And the null hypothesis for this is that the distribution is normal. So let's just run that test. And I think you have that code as well. Okay, you do. So here's the result of that test, right? So our p-value is very, 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 very small. So it is definitely less than 0.05. Because our p-value is less than 0.05, we can reject the null hypothesis. And remember, the null hypothesis is that our distribution is normal. So we're rejecting that null hypothesis in favor of the alternative, which is our data is not normally distributed. Okay, so I think the last thing I did was check skewness. I'm just going to copy and paste that in the chat, and that's just like, you can kind of see that it is based on the QQ plot, but that's just sort of one final check. In your final project, if you do like all of these, you know, tests, like that's totally fine. If you were to just do like a couple of them, that's fine too. Actually, as we like, if in a lot of times when we, you know, if you were to just run this, for example, like the Shapiro-Wilk test in a histogram, that's totally fine. I think really what I want to see is, you know, what the assumptions of these different tests are, and you're just kind of checking. You're looking for outliers, you're looking for normality of your distribution before deciding whether to run a t-test or, you know, or a corresponding non-parametric test. Okay, so, and that's probably not very reassuring, right? Where like, I think, so statistics, like it's mathematics. So it's true. There's no, you know, like for math, there's like only one right answer. But in terms of like methods, so what methods we use in our analyses, like sometimes that's up for debate. And this happens even like at work, you know, we're putting in, you know, grants right now at work for different research projects, you know, and you know, my suggestion was to run a particular model and set up our data in this way. And then, you know, another epidemiologist suggested that we run it this way. And so then we just kind of, you know, we talk it out and decide, okay, given our data, given what we want to look at, given how we want to treat certain variables, I think this modeling or this method approach, you know, makes the best sense. So, so in that way, it's kind of like maybe not super, you know, there's no like one right answer. And you'll see this in the literature, which is why, you know, we have different answers. You know, even if researchers are looking at the same thing, not only do they have different samples, but they might also be using different methods as well. But in this case, in the case of like just testing continuous variables, so we're looking at whether the means or the distributions are the same for moderate activity for men versus women. So far from what we've seen, looking at outliers and looking at normality of our data, even after removing those outliers, what do you guys think? Should we use a t-test? And remember, one of the assumptions is that our data are normally distributed, or do you think maybe we should use a non-parametric alternative to that? Okay, awesome. Yes.
Thinking alternative.
Yes. Okay. So in this case, a non-parametric alternative probably makes more sense. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do that. So the non-parametric alternative to the independent group t-test is the Wilcoxon rank sum test. Sorry. So we're going to go ahead and run that. And so I'm scrolling down, sorry. Okay, so here is the code for that test. And it looks a lot like our t-test, right? Here. So I'm going to put that in the chat. And again, I apologize because I know that what we're doing now kind of is getting ahead of what we've been discussing in the lecture. Like I know I kind of threw it out there as an alternative, a non-parametric alternative to the t-test, but it was like one slide and it was probably very quickly, you know, glossed over. So I apologize, but I do want to point out that this is probably the more appropriate test in this case after everything we've done. So I'm going to run that. Okay. If you look down here in the console area, it gives us the results. So our p-value is 0.07. And so remember, for the non-parametric tests, so for the t-test, it's saying the means are the same. For these non-parametric tests, it's just the distribution is the same. And so the distribution of moderate activity for men is the same as the distribution for moderate activity for women. And then the result of that test is we have a p-value of 0.07. So it's greater than 0.05. So what conclusion would we make in this case? So because it's greater than 0.05, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Exactly. So we would then say that the distribution of moderate activity is the same for men and women in our sample, right? Given our sample. So as you're going through the exercise, when you're writing it up, you know, that's how you would interpret this result. And then you would describe, because I think there's, in the exercise, it asks you, you know, give 1 or 2 lines of, you know, interpreting your findings. So this is what you would do. And you would say, like, after removing outliers, you know, the data did not appear to be normally distributed. So we chose to run a Wilcoxon rank sum test. And our p-value is 0.07. And so therefore we're concluding that, you know, the minutes of moderate activity per day don't differ for men versus women. And then just for sort of like comparison's sake, I wanted to run the t-test as well. Sorry, let me go back and describe this. Okay, so moderate activity, remember it's y tilde x. So moderate activity is our y, or our outcome variable. So we put that first, and then the tilde. And then RIA gender is the variable name for gender. And remember, we get that from the code book. Okay, and that link for the code book is in the Word document. So we have to go back and look at what that variable name for gender is. And then our data set is mod 5. So mod 5 is the one with all of the outliers removed. And then we're telling the function with this argument that it's not paired. So we're specifying that they're independent groups. Okay, and it's pretty similar to the t-test code. And we've run the t-test before. So, you know, the variances are equal, and then we're just specifying alternative is 2-sided. And I think these are actually the default values for this. But I just put that in there just sort of for completion or completeness. Okay, so that's the t-test formula. So if I were to run the t-test just to compare, it doesn't always happen, but it does happen to happen in this case. So the p-value is less than 0.05 in this case. So if we were to use a t-test, we would actually conclude that there's no difference, in this case, in the means. So the mean moderate activity for men, and the value looks like it's about 43 minutes in men and 41 minutes in women, are different, are statistically different from each other. So that interpretation is different actually than what we get using our non-parametric test. Okay, so I'll pause there.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So when you did the Wilcox test, we
Mhm.
looked specifically at moderate activity and gender, but we could potentially use that parametric, non-parametric test with any two variables, right?
Yeah, so if you find that your outcome variable, so let's say now you're looking at, we're actually going to look at vigorous activity. So if you were to do that and you were looking at, and I believe question 3 also asks, how do they compare for general health? And if you remember from last week, we created this binary general health value variable. So because that's a 2-level predictor variable, and we have a continuous outcome, you could use this rank sum test for that as well. If your data is normally distributed, you should get approximately the same results if you were to use the non-parametric tests or the t-test. But because our data in this case for moderate activity, it's not normally distributed, the more appropriate test would be this rank sum test. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. It's
Okay.
because as we're going through this, I'm always kind of thinking about my thesis, like if
Oh,
I
okay.
was to use these things, all of these codes.
Okay.
So I'm always like trying to apply it to other things too.
Oh, okay. If you want, can you describe your outcome variable and then your independent or your predictor variables or variable, or if you have more than one?
Well, so my variables are a lot of them are going to be categorical.
Okay.
So I'm also just kind of trying to like, I'm trying to follow and everything, so I'm not super like proficient in all of this right now. But so I would be looking at, like, rather than looking at like genders in my thesis, I think I would be looking more at like whether or not they fall into different categories, and then
Okay.
seeing the two categories and I'm looking at pain levels. So I would be
Okay.
looking at like if they perform this type of exercise, their pain levels would be here versus if they're doing this other type of exercise.
Okay. Okay. So it sounds like, you will end up using one of these 2 tests, or if you have more than one predictor variable. So like if you're looking at exercise, like type of exercise, but you're also looking at if it differs by men and women, but as an example, then you would probably extend that then to an ANOVA. So hopefully, like some of the examples that we look at for this exercise and future exercises, hopefully something will stick and it'll be sort of the method that you'll end up wanting to use. So I'll just note here too that a couple of students already have, but please feel free, like if you're working on your thesis and you would like assistance with your, like the methods and what statistical approach to use, obviously your advisor would be the first person to go to for that. But, but if you, want additional assistance, or maybe if your, advisor is also curious, like what, methods to apply, feel free to reach out to me as well. So I'm happy to help with that too. It's actually been really interesting for me because I think, as I've said before, a lot of the types of research that all of you are doing and are interested in, it's so different from what I do at work. And so it's actually been very fun for me to kind of like think about what methods I would apply for the type of data that you have, because it is just so different. So, for example, some of you are taking repeated measures like every single minute, which is just like mind blowing to me because, the data that I work with and Sabir works with, we have a lot of people. So we have now almost 250,000 people, but we're only surveying them every 3 years. So we only have these repeated measures data every 3 years. versus you guys in some cases have it like every second, every minute, you know, so you're collecting like thousands and thousands of like data points in a smaller sample. So the data structure is just very, very different. You know, so it's just been very interesting for me. So I'm, you know, if you feel confident enough in like reaching out and asking for like help with methods, it's, you know, for me, it's also very interesting. So I appreciate it. Okay, let me check the time. So we have 15 minutes left. Let me just think, how are you guys feeling? Because we can go through vigorous activity. It's basically going to be exactly what we did for moderate activity. So, so I can give you two options. We can go through it together to kind of like solidify everything we just did with moderate activity. I'm totally happy to do that. Or we can end class a little bit early and I can just send you the program that I have, which basically, so I'm gonna just scroll down a little bit so you can see on my screen. So basically I'm doing the same thing with vigorous activity. And in this case, I'm creating different data sets. I'm now calling it NHANES Vigorous 1 to distinguish it from the moderate data sets. And doing the same thing. I'm identifying outliers, I'm removing them, removing sort of implausible you know, values, and then I'm running this function outlier KD to just do this like one big sweep of removing the outliers before I run my analysis. So we can go through this again now, or if you guys want, I can also just end class early and then send this code to you and you can go ahead and try to run the vigorous activity on your own and see how that works out. So what do you guys think? I'm totally impartial. Whatever is going to be more helpful for you will be the better thing. So, okay. Okay, so one person has said, you know, to run it on your own. How does everyone else feel about that? The other thing I can do is if some of you want to go through it now, we can. And then for those of you who want to just run it on your own, you can also just drop off. That's totally fine too. Okay, so everyone actually is okay with running it on your own. Is there anybody who wants to stay on? And if you do, I'm happy to do that with you. So, okay. All right, so I'm just gonna assume that everyone is okay with trying to run vigorous activity on your own. If you can, go ahead and try to do, so the other part of question 3 is, so there's like four parts. It's looking at, wait, hold on. Let me just go back to the exercise. It's multiple parts. It's looking at moderate activity, it's looking at vigorous activity by gender, and then it's looking at those outcomes by general health. So, so if you can on your own, and it would be very, very similar code. So this is the first time I'm kind of like, okay, launch. All right, you guys go ahead and try to do this on your own. Try to do what we just did with gender. So you'll have the vigorous activity code, but go ahead and try to modify that code for a comparison with general health. So go ahead and try that on your own, but we'll cover it in class next week. You know, more briefly, we can kind of just go through it. And then if you have issues doing the general health comparison on your own, definitely feel free to email me. And then the last thing that I'll say is I will also get back to you with your exercises this week. So I apologize. It probably should have been more like last week. If you haven't turned in your exercise already, you know, please do so soon and just let me know if you're having issues with the exercise, you know, like code is not running, whatever, you know, please reach out to me and I can help you out with that. So, okay, so we'll end there. Yes, and I have recorded the video, so you'll be able to rewatch the video, and I will also post the R code that we used today. So everything up until this point, including the vigorous activity code, I will post that to Cougar Courses after class. So you'll have that to do on your own. And then again, go ahead and try to replicate those analyses, looking at gender, replicate them looking at general health. Okay?
I have another question.
Sure.
Should we be sending you like our exercise 2? Should we have already sent you what we have done so far, or should we just send it to you when it's complete all the way through?
No, we'll wait until we're at the very end. So kind of like with exercise 1, we'll wait until we've covered everything in exercise 2, and then I'll have you guys submit it. And hopefully, the plan is to kind of be able to finish exercise 2 in class, and then, work through probably exercise 3, and there's 2 more exercises a little bit more independently, where you guys will start to hopefully code more and more on your own, unless there's new functions or new code that you would need to use. Then we'll definitely cover that in class 2. So kind of I feel like this process is working for everybody. I'm hoping, where we go through the exercises together, and then so for this general health and exercise, minutes of exercise daily, this will be kind of the first time where you're kind of going to try to do this, look at something on your own. But it's very similar to the gender comparison. So hopefully it's kind of a soft launch. But does that sound okay? So yeah, don't worry about turning in exercise 2 probably for another couple of weeks. Okay. So that's all I had. I'm going to stop recording, and then I will post the code to Cougar Courses and sort of repost hey, look at gender. I mean, not gender, general health if you can. And then we will cover it next week though. So if you're not able to, don't worry. We'll go over general health quickly, and then we'll move on to question 4. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.